Welcome back to Washington Journal. We're talking about U.S. immigration and asylum policy with our guest, Krish O'Mara Vignarajah. She's the president and CEO of the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. Krish, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
Tell us about your work at the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, and especially as it relates to asylum services.
Sure. So Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service is the largest faith-based national nonprofit dedicated exclusively to serving refugees, asylum seekers, other vulnerable immigrants who have come to the U.S. We've operated for nearly 85 years in this work of service and advocacy. We've welcomed over 750,000 refugees and immigrants who live here in the United States. In terms of our work with asylum seekers, these are people who are exercising a legal right to seek asylum, fleeing war, persecution, violence. And so we help them in the immediate term in terms of room and board, helping them get to their final destination, trying to provide legal referrals so that they can have access and better understanding of how the system works.
And as far as funding goes, I know you take funding from donations, private donations from the public. What else?
Yeah, so our funding is really a public-private partnership. So as a national resettlement agency, LIRS partners with the federal government. So we work with the Department of State as well as the Department of Health and Human Services. But also we rely on donations from a variety of private sources, philanthropic foundations, major corporations, and then, as you said, the generosity of everyday Americans.
And talking about the negotiations going on in the Senate, both Republicans and Democrats reportedly agree about tightening asylum standards. Can you tell us first what they are currently? How does the asylum system work right now, and what threshold do seekers need to meet?
Yeah, so the debates right now center around the standard for credible fear. So this has been a discussion that originated really decades ago as Congress essentially created the expedited removal proceeding process that would allow people to be deported without a hearing before a judge. But to mitigate against the risk that people who have a legal right to come here to the U.S. Would be deported without any possibility of seeking that legal right, Congress created a credible fear interview to aid in a proper adjudication. So this is essentially a preliminary screening for people before they would be placed in removal proceedings. So during a credible fear interview, an asylum officer interviews the person to determine if there's what we call a significant possibility that they could kind of establish an asylum claim. Congress really intended the legal standard for credible fear interviews to be lower than what is required for the final grant of asylum, because the credible fear interview is just the preliminary stage. And so what's being debated right now is to really throw that system out the door, and kind of what was behind congressional intent initially, because it would raise the legal standard to a more likely than not standard. And so in that way, it would actually contradict Congress's intent in creating the credible fear interview standard back in 1996.
And is there anything that the asylum seekers would need to prove? Are they required to show documentation? And then do they have, for instance, a lawyer with them, or how does that work?
Yeah, so essentially what they need to prove is that there is a credible fear that they have, experienced persecution as a result of their connection to one of five different categories. So it may be that they were politically persecuted. It could be that they were persecuted because of their religion. It could be that they were, persecuted because of their, social organizing. So they need to, in that interview, explain why it was that they were specifically targeted as individuals, and why, if they were, returned, they would face a serious threat. And then after they meet that credible fear threshold, they do need to submit paperwork. And that will ultimately, if they do meet the credible fear and they are allowed to move forward with their legal proceeding, they will then go before an immigration judge and they'll have additional paperwork to kind of validate the claim.
And how long does that process usually take right now?
Yeah, so on average, it's about 4 years.
And in that 4 years, I'm assuming they're allowed to just stay in the United States.
Yeah, so so some number are not going to meet the credible fear threshold, and they will be put in expedited removal proceedings, and they will be deported. But for those who have met this test, they will be allowed to remain in the U.S. There is a decision that officers make of whether they'll go into immigration detention until their hearing or they'll be released. Knowing that, we are talking about parents who are fleeing for their lives and to protect their children, who do not pose any sort of national security risk. There is no reason to believe that we would, fear their entry into, U.S. communities. Those people are allowed to enter communities for a very, very small subset. And frankly, because this immigration detention has been set up and supported by Congress, there are some number of people who will go into immigration detention. Happy to talk more about that. But what we have shown is that there are better ways to manage immigrants that allow them to proceed legally, but that is actually far cheaper and still meets our immigration proceeding demands.
Krish, I'm going to show a short portion of Oklahoma Senator James Lankford. He's the lead Republican negotiator in the Senate border talks, and he was talking about this issue of asylum seekers being let into the country.
You cross the border on the southern border, those individuals are asking, quote unquote, for asylum. Asylum means I have fear in my home country and there's nowhere that I can go to get safety. Those people are saying the same thing that I hear from people over and over again when I'm at the border. I'm coming for opportunity, I'm coming for a job, I'm coming to be able to have a better life. That is not asylum. They don't qualify for asylum, but the Biden administration is not turning them around at the border and say you have to apply legally. You can't just literally cross in one day where we have no criminal background check, no information about their background or their history. Many of them, we don't even have documents. They just walk in and say what country they're from and say what their name is, and they come take on a brand new identity here in the United States. Everyone sees that as a national security risk, apparently other than Chuck Schumer. In the last 2 years, this White House has had 70,000 people they have designated as special interest aliens. These are individuals that are coming from Iran, from Iraq, from Pakistan, from areas of known terrorism that have been released into the country, literally unscreened, except are their names listed on our terror watch list. Otherwise, we have no criminal background history on them, have no idea. Those were released in the country, 70,000 just in the last 2 years. We've had almost 300 people that were picked up that were on the terror watch list just in the last 3 years.
Yeah.
So the threat is very real on this, and we should take it seriously.
Krish, your reaction to that?
I think it's important to understand that, there is agreement that if you are seeking asylum, you ought to meet the threshold and the requirements for that. Economic migrants ought to come into the U.S. Through visa processes. Candidly, I think there's also bipartisan agreement that we need more visas for economic reasons. And frankly, we're undermining ourselves. When we have about 9 million jobs that are unfilled and only 6 million unemployed Americans, there is a real opportunity for us to, bring to fruition that win-win that immigration can be economically. That said, I think it's important to understand that for the people who are seeking asylum, sometimes people, question, well, why are they coming to the southern border for that reason? They're only allowed to exercise their legal right to asylum if they are on American soil. And so that is why they are coming to the southern border. I know Senator Lankford kind of alludes to the suggestion that immigrants are dangerous to our communities. The reality is that the data does not prove that out. Whether you're talking about the southern border, where you find that by many metrics, they're actually safer. Those 21 counties that are across the U.S. border compared to counties on the interior. So the idea that immigrants are coming, that they're seeking to perpetrate crimes, could not be farther from the truth. But the final point is, look, as an immigration advocate, I firmly believe that as a sovereign nation, we of course need to know who is coming across our border. We need to have the checks and balances to ensure that there is monitoring. But that requires us to recognize that for 3 decades, we have had a dysfunctional immigration system. Why are Indians and Chinese coming to our southern border? Why do we have 20,000 Ukrainians come across the southern border? It was because other pathways had essentially been precluded because they are backlogged and they don't work. And that's where we need leadership. We don't need grandstanding to say what's not working. We need leaders to step up and say, here's how we're going to fix the problem. Because if we don't, we're actually undermining our own self-interest.
And we will open the phones shortly, so you can start calling in now. Republicans 202-748-8001, Democrats 202-748-8000, and Independents 202-748-8002. Republicans also want to do away with what's known as humanitarian parole. Can you explain what that is, how it works, and what the recommendation is?
Yeah, so humanitarian parole is a power that, every administration has had for decades. It is essentially an authority that allows for an administration to grant temporary status for humanitarian reasons or when it is in the interests of the public. And so it is, when you kind of, talk about congressional negotiations, it's a real sad irony that we're debating a supplemental that is designed to help Ukraine defend its people, but it could also limit the legal mechanism that many Ukrainians use to find safety here in the U.S. The debate right now is, some members of Congress feel like the administration has misused that system. But I think it's important to understand that this is only a temporary pathway. These are not people who are granted a permanent legal status. And it's been used in crisis situations, whether we're talking about Ukrainians after Putin's invasion or Venezuela in recognition of the fact that there is massive political instability as a result of an authoritarian regime.
And Krish, real quick, what's the difference between an asylum seeker and a refugee?
Yeah, great question. So a refugee is someone who has crossed an international border. They have applied through the UN or directly through the US government in order to be resettled in a host nation. The US, other Western nations participate in this UN system. They will wait years in a refugee camp or some other country, and it is there that their legal process takes place. If they're one of the lucky few, about 1%, just less than that, are actually resettled outside of where they, were camping out. And so very few actually get refugee relief. But when they enter a country like the United States, essentially their legal process in kind of that uncertainty is over because they will then be allowed to apply for a green card and then become citizens. It's a system that has bipartisan support. We've actually resettled more refugees under Republican administrations than Democratic ones. And it really, these are individuals who go through extreme vetting. It's a system that has been created and honed over 4 decades. An asylum seeker is different in the sense that when they arrive at the country that they are seeking asylum, that is really what initiates and allows them to begin the process. So that's kind of the primary difference. But what is similar is that they may be fleeing for the very same reasons, meaning political persecution or religious persecution.
We have a question here from Jimbo in Bakersfield, California, who says, can your guest explain why immigrants fleeing violence in Guatemala would not seek asylum in Mexico, as opposed to the United States? Wouldn't Mexico be the, quote, first nation to seek asylum?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the reality is that when you think about what's happening in Mexico, it is not a safe country. There's been debates about policies that are essentially kind of, if you transit through a quote unquote safe country, then that would preclude you from coming to the US and applying for asylum. The sad reality is that when you are coming from Guatemala, You are going to a country like Mexico, where on a daily basis you see headlines about gang violence, about the drug cartels, about sexual assault, murders. And so as a result, we know from our clients who even were in Mexico on a transit basis that they have experienced extreme violence and hardship. And so that is why Mexico, in many respects, is not a viable, safe third country.
All right, let's bring callers into the conversation. Elizabeth is up first in Las Vegas.